I can try with this if you prefer. I feel I should break into song if I've got one of these in my hand. I'll try not to. So thanks for inviting me, and for the next hour, I was asked to do about 80 minutes, which seems a bit extreme. So we'll do an hour and see how we go from that. The title changed from the original advertised title, so it's Islam, Social Media and the Cloud. And this alludes to a chapter that I have in a book, Islam in the Modern World, which came out earlier this year. It's edited by Kenny and Musa. The research, this is the advertising bit, also links into my books. I Muslims, which came out in 2009, is the most recent one. I've got another book which is in progress at the moment, and some of the work also links into book Virtually Islamic and Islam in the Digital Age. So those are the sort of core books, and then there's lots of chapters and articles and bits and pieces as well. So just to explain, for the use of the hashtag, it's really a reference to social networking. Of course, it's a reference to Twitter and social media feeds. And the cloud is a link really which refers to the fact that we're less desk-bound than we were when we were using computers even 5 years ago. When I started this work, which was over 15 years ago, I'll explain the link about the computers. I worked in computers a little bit before coming into academia, and then when I was studying Islam, I noticed when talking to scholars doing my PhD research on decision-making processes, this is in the mid-90s, it was interesting that at that time scholars were starting to use the internet as a decision-making tool. This was in Pakistan and Malaysia where I was doing my research in the mid-90s. Very old computers, steam-driven computers back in the mid-90s. Just about the time of the emergence of the browser, you can imagine that. So it was all desk-based, no mobiles, no tablets, iPads and so forth. But people were starting to exchange ideas within that primitive technological time. People were starting to exchange ideas about religion, how to interpret religious ideas and concepts, in particular in relation to ijtihad, the idea of sort of pragmatic interpretation of Islam, according to various approaches to primary sources. People were starting to exchange ideas and set up new ideas and networks, which really transcended the original and traditional networks of religious authority. This was in the mid-90s, and it was a very early phase, but that was when I started to become more aware of the relevance of computers. It was around that time I started lecturing as well, and I noticed that students started to bring URLs into their essays. Can you possibly imagine researching an essay, a paper, a dissertation, without the use of the internet? Anybody here who doesn't use the internet at all for any of their research? So that's nobody. Well, at that time this was very new, the idea that people bringing in URLs, bringing in web resources, and of course these ideas were coming from all over the place in terms of the internet, without actually considering the veracity of the sources, where they were coming from, whether they were genuine, whether they were fabricated, and so forth. And that's got a big, well, that's a big issue when it's talking about ideas of religious authority. So that was in the mid-90s, and that's where, again, some of my interest came from. And I started to pull together various links of websites. At that time, about 96, 97, it was possible to assemble a page of Islamic studies links, a single page with 20 links, and that was about it, outside of people using FTP to transfer files across, copies of the Quran or interpretations. Here was this page of 20 links which I set up. Now, of course, if you attempted to build a page of links in relation to internet resources, you're talking, well, it'd be an impossible task. Tens of thousands of links would be necessary. But at that time, it was possible to bring those links down into a relatively small web page. So that's something about how I got into the subject area and how I started monitoring what was going on online. And I realized that a lot of the content that was appearing online wasn't being recorded. A lot of it was just disappearing into the ether. So there were no copies of the pages that were coming out. So I started to record what was going on. I had to construct a methodology as I progressed because there wasn't one really for recording the internet. And looking at methodological approaches to try and do it in an almost scientific way. I mean, that's impossible really, given the shifts in internet technology and the way in which things have gone forward. When I started, I was just looking at very basic early web pages. Anybody remember Mosaic, the early web browser? You're probably wondering what I'm talking about. That was one of the first browsers that came out. So I started recording material from that time, from when the browsers came out. And it was very primitive. But we'll see as we look at some of these slides that the technology's improved, that we've had to integrate multimedia into the studies, different forms of social connectivity, ideas about social networking, and that brings us through to contemporary spheres and looking at Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. I sort of framed the presentation around a few questions which I'm going to touch upon, looking at the immediacy and searchability of the net, how these factors are impacting on ideas about Islamic religious authority online, and how different hierarchies of authority have developed, specifically in relation to social media. And the factor that really interests me is the way in which traditional authorities have in some cases been challenged and usurped online by contenders whose authority is in some cases based on their digital proficiency and online networking rather than their traditional knowledge frameworks and traditional ideas of authority. So what I mean by that is the emergence of new, quote, authorities who have appeared online, who might not have any training within traditional religious frameworks, they might not have gone through traditional Islamic universities, for example, but still feel that they can put up a web page, they can answer questions, they can present themselves as a religious authority. And I've looked through my books and my other studies into how they've managed to do that, and in some cases whether they've pulled it off successfully or not. Within the contemporary framework, I have to ask, in what ways do social media impact upon notions of religious understandings? I'll be drawing upon a variety of sources. It depends how quickly I speak and how fast I get through the slides. First element within this is having to have some sort of framework with which to approach the subject area. So cyber Islamic environments was the term that appeared within my book, Virtually Islamic, and that's the title that I've used for a variety of concepts associated with Islam. This is the interesting factor here, is that my presentation was put onto a Mac and it's been translated to because we don't have a Mac connection here, it's been translated to a Windows thing very quickly, and of course some of the slides have disappeared as well. So I'll improvise. So if you're wondering why the words are sort of shifted over to the right, let me define, that's the reason why. So I'm going to give some definitions about some of the terms anyway. I introduced the term originally as an idea about an online space, an online internet space with an Islamic religious orientation. But it's evolved to include factors associated with Web 2.0, as well as alternative interfaces like smartphones and TVs with net access. So we've moved from the model of cyber Islamic environments being desk-bound, where you had to go to an office, sit at a desk, and look at the material, through to a very different interactive experience where individuals are using their mobiles, using their tablets, using laptops, and you could be almost anywhere approaching this material, anywhere with a good 3G signal, or anywhere with Wi-Fi, and you can access this material. Cyber Islamic environments, they would include a variety of types of media which I've tried to approach over the years, like blogs, social networking sites, and different types of interfaces. What we've seen since the 90s is a shift where within contemporary context, computer literate digital natives are utilizing the net for expressions of Islamic spirituality, ideas about religion, ideas about networking and religious identity. That might be natural to many of you who have grown up using computers or accessing the net with phones, or even through Xboxes, PlayStations, and so forth. But 20 years or so ago, that wasn't such a natural process, and people had to learn how to go online. Now, for cyber Islamic environments, it's a very natural process to go to the net, go to Google, go and look for the answer to a religious question, go to a website. Another interesting factor that links into wider studies in relation to religion online is the way in which the internet can provide a sense of liminality between the profane and sacred world, a digital interface which might, for some people, give a sense of the numinous and a connection between leaders and followers, revelation and reader, or recitation and listener. What I'm interested in there really is whether ideas about religious experience can be mediated through digital interfaces. If people are praying and they're using a laptop in order to facilitate that, does that become part of the experience? Does that enhance their experience? And does it give them some form of religious experience within that interface? And of course, even from 5 years ago, we're talking about reduced digital divides as well. The fact that we've got broader levels of usage. Even though, while I'm discussing these cyber Islamic environments, I'm aware that there are many areas of the world which still don't have very good internet connections. People still using a single phone line to get onto the internet. You might remember the pain of that 5 or 10 years ago. I can remember 15 years ago waiting about, it seemed like a week, but I think it was about half a day for a photograph to come down the line, because the speeds were just so slow, so torturous. I mean, there are still many places in the world where that still applies, including in Wales, where I'm from, including my office. But generally, we kind of expect a decent level of internet access. What we're also seeing now in relation to cyber Islamic environments is the idea that we shouldn't separate the digital from the analog. The digital experience of religion and the mediation of religion is linked to the so-called real world experience and mediation of religion. There's no separation necessarily between what happens online and what happens offline. And there's an integration too. I can remember even a couple of years ago asking, maybe I should ask you the same question. How many Facebook users do we have here? So a show of hands. Okay, interesting. Okay, that's just about everybody. How many people actively go to the computer and turn Facebook on? How many people have it on all the time? Is there a constant stream? How many times an hour do some people check Facebook? Let's see if we can break some records. Once an hour? Any advance on once an hour, on average? Maybe in Wales the dynamics are different, but I mean, when I asked that question to my students, I said, well, when do you turn Facebook on? They said, well, we don't turn it on, it's never off. It's constantly streaming. It's always there. There's always going to be an alert. There's always going to be a bleep on your phone telling you there's an update. There's always going to be something happening. And it's that idea that the social media is always on, and it's a constant factor. That has implications in relation to cyber Islamic environments too, because the compartmentalization of religion becomes more problematic when you've got religious feeds constantly on, when you're always checking Twitter or Facebook to find out the latest update from a particular scholar or religious authority or so forth. That constancy is an interesting factor that still trying to get a grip with, in particular in relation to Twitter, the fact that Twitter is always updated. I feel sometimes if I'm following a story that if I go away for half an hour, I feel really out of date because there's just so much going on. That happened to me with the Arab Spring, in particular, so-called Arab Spring, where I was following, and there were tens of thousands of tweets per hour coming through from Tahrir Square and other locations. That constancy, that never-ending flow of information is an important one. That's just a thing about smartphones, we can forget about that one. Also the diversity of media that we have to contend with, if you're studying this in any framework at all. I think that in relation to the study of Islam and the internet, it's becoming less and less compartmentalized in that you can discreetly study Islam and Muslims on the internet and networking and so forth. But the study of Islam on the internet also permeates within many other studies of contemporary Islam and things to do with Islam in the modern world. So that diversity of resources and materials is being reflected in a lot of contemporary studies as well. It's one of the first things I do if I see a new book on contemporary Islam is to see how much about the internet has been included within the conversations in the chapters. Because it's an essential current or subtext within many of the things that are going on within contemporary Islamic spheres today. So we do have this incredible diversity and range of possible interfaces that one can approach Islam with. That's just a reference to the dramatic use of Twitter in 2011. If you're interested in that particular area, then I've written about it in a book, Arab Society in Revolt. The importance of cell phones has really come into focus over the last 4 or 5 years, perhaps with the so-called Green Revolution in Iran, where we saw a substantial amount of innovation in the way in which social media sources